He simply noticed a strange lump on a tree and decided to cut it down, expecting nothing unusual. But when the trunk fell and he looked inside, he was shocked. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The forest lay far beyond the last paved road, in a stretch of mountains most people passed on maps without giving a second thought. One narrow gravel track led into it, winding between slopes scarred by old landslides and bends where rainwater carved deep grooves into the ground. In winter, the road disappeared beneath snow and ice, and in summer it softened into mud that swallowed tires and patience alike. There were no signs marking the boundary of the area, no warnings, no explanations. The forest did not announce itself. It simply began, dense and quiet, as if the land had decided long ago that it had no need for visitors. The trees grew close together, their crowns interlocking so tightly that daylight struggled to reach the forest floor. Moss-covered rocks, fallen branches, even the exposed roots of standing trunks, giving everything a muted green-gray hue. Streams appeared without warning, thin ribbons of cold water slipping between stones, only to vanish again beneath layers of soil and needles. Sound behaved strangely there. The wind hummed high above, but down below it often felt as if the air itself had been stilled. Birds were scarce, and when they did cry out, the sound seemed swallowed almost immediately by the mass of wood and shadow. The logging companies referred to the area in neutral terms. It was a difficult sector, remote and inefficient, prone to storm damage and costly delays. On paper, it was nothing more than coordinates and acreage. Among workers, however, the forest carried a different weight. Older crews spoke about it with lowered voices, never directly, as if naming the place too clearly might call attention to it. Stories circulated during long drives and quiet evenings, half-finished anecdotes that always trailed off before reaching conclusions. People talked about men who had gone missing decades ago, about hunting camps abandoned overnight, about equipment found rusting far from any marked trail. There were no official records, no confirmed incidents that could be pointed to with certainty, yet the unease persisted, passed from one generation of workers to the next. Most dismissed the stories as exaggerations born of isolation and fatigue. Forests, after all, were dangerous by nature. Accidents happened, people got lost, but even those who laughed at the rumors tended to avoid certain gullies and clearings. Some left coins wedged into tree bark near an old stone outcrop at the edge of the sector. Others made sure never to work alone once the sun began to sink behind the ridges. These habits were never explained aloud. They were simply adopted quietly, as if everyone understood without needing to say why. Marcus had heard all of it before his boots ever touched the soil there. He was not new to logging, nor to difficult terrain. Years in the trade had taught him how quickly complacency could turn into injury, or worse. He was a steady man, broad-shouldered and strong, with movements shaped by repetition and muscle memory rather than haste. Among the crew, he was known as someone who did not talk much, but paid attention. He noticed small things others missed, subtle changes in wind, the way a tree leaned just slightly against expectation, the faint difference in sound when metal met wood that wasn't quite solid. Logging had never been his childhood dream, but it had become his craft. It paid consistently, demanded respect for both tools and environment, and rewarded those who stayed alert. Marcus valued that balance. He disliked the idea of spending his days enclosed by walls and screens, measuring time by digital clocks instead of the position of the sun. Out here, work was physical and immediate. Mistakes had consequences, but effort did too. The forest did not care who you were, only how you moved through it. The assignment came after a storm tore through the region, sending winds strong enough to snap mature trunks and loosen soil on the slopes. Several access roads were blocked by fallen timber, and damaged trees leaned at dangerous angles over equipment routes. Clearing the area was necessary, and that necessity outweighed the forest's reputation. The company assembled a small but experienced crew, supplemented by a few younger workers eager to prove themselves. Marcus accepted the assignment without comment. The pay was good, and he trusted his ability to handle difficult ground. He simply noticed a strange lump on a tree and decided to cut it down, expecting nothing unusual. But when the trunk fell and he looked inside, he was shocked. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The forest lay far beyond the last paved road, in a stretch of mountains most people passed on maps without giving a second thought. One narrow gravel track led into it, winding between slopes scarred by old landslides and bends where rainwater carved deep grooves into the ground. In winter, the road disappeared beneath snow and ice, and in summer it softened into mud that swallowed tires and patience alike. There were no signs marking the boundary of the area, no warnings, no explanations. The forest did not announce itself. It simply began, dense and quiet, as if the land had decided long ago that it had no need for visitors. The trees grew close together, their crowns interlocking so tightly that daylight struggled to reach the forest floor. Moss-covered rocks, fallen branches, even the exposed roots of standing trunks, giving everything a muted green-gray hue. Streams appeared without warning, thin ribbons of cold water slipping between stones, only to vanish again beneath layers of soil and needles. Sound behaved strangely there. The wind hummed high above, but down below it often felt as if the air itself had been stilled. Birds were scarce, and when they did cry out, the sound seemed swallowed almost immediately by the mass of wood and shadow. The logging companies referred to the area in neutral terms. It was a difficult sector, remote and inefficient, prone to storm damage and costly delays. On paper, it was nothing more than coordinates and acreage. Among workers, however, the forest carried a different weight. Older crews spoke about it with lowered voices, never directly, as if naming the place too clearly might call attention to it. Stories circulated during long drives and quiet evenings, half-finished anecdotes that always trailed off before reaching conclusions. People talked about men who had gone missing decades ago, about hunting camps abandoned overnight, about equipment found rusting far from any marked trail. There were no official records, no confirmed incidents that could be pointed to with certainty, yet the unease persisted, passed from one generation of workers to the next. Most dismissed the stories as exaggerations born of isolation and fatigue. Forests, after all, were dangerous by nature. Accidents happened. People got lost. But even those who laughed at the rumors tended to avoid certain gullies and clearings. Some left coins wedged into tree bark near an old stone outcrop at the edge of the sector. Others made sure never to work alone once the sun began to sink behind the ridges. These habits were never explained aloud. They were simply adopted quietly, as if everyone understood without needing to say why. Marcus had heard all of it before his boots ever touched the soil there. He was not new to logging, nor to difficult terrain. Years in the trade had taught him how quickly complacency could turn into injury, or worse. He was a steady man, broad-shouldered and strong, with movements shaped by repetition and muscle memory rather than haste. Among the crew, he was known as someone who did not talk much, but paid attention. He noticed small things others missed, subtle changes in wind, the way a tree leaned just slightly against expectation, the faint difference in sound when metal met wood that wasn't quite solid. Logging had never been his childhood dream, but it had become his craft. It paid consistently, demanded respect for both tools and environment, and rewarded those who stayed alert. Marcus valued that balance. He disliked the idea of spending his days enclosed by walls and screens, measuring time by digital clocks instead of the position of the sun. Out here, work was physical and immediate. Mistakes had consequences, but effort did too. The forest did not care who you were, only how you moved through it. The assignment came after a storm tore through the region, sending winds strong enough to snap mature trunks and loosen soil on the slopes. Several access roads were blocked by fallen timber, and damaged trees leaned at dangerous angles over equipment routes. Clearing the area was necessary, and that necessity outweighed the forest. The assignment came after a storm tore through the region, sending winds strong enough to snap mature trunks and loosen soil on the slopes. Several access roads were blocked by fallen timber, and damaged trees leaned at dangerous angles over equipment routes. Clearing the area was necessary, and that necessity outweighed the forest's reputation. The company assembled a small but experienced crew, supplemented by a few younger workers eager to prove themselves. Marcus accepted the assignment without comment. The pay was good, and he trusted his ability to handle difficult ground. From the moment they arrived, the place felt heavier than most forests Marcus had worked in. The air carried the sharp scent of pine mixed with damp earth, but beneath it lingered something stale, almost metallic, as if the ground itself remembered old disturbances. Fog clung to the lower slopes even after sunrise, threading between trunks and refusing to lift. The usual signs of wildlife were scarce. Tracks appeared and vanished unpredictably, as if animals passed through quickly without settling. As the crew set up their temporary camp, Marcus moved methodically, unloading equipment and checking supplies. He noticed how the ground near certain trees was compacted in odd patterns, not entirely natural, though time had blurred the marks. He saw scars on bark that did not match lightning strikes or animal damage. These details alone meant little, but together they created an impression he could not ignore. The forest felt used, then abandoned, as though something had happened here that no one wanted to remember. Work began as planned. Chainsaws roared, sending vibrations through the earth, and the smell of gasoline mixed with fresh-cut wood. Despite ear protection, Marcus could still feel the hum of machinery in his bones, a familiar sensation that usually grounded him. Here, however, it only emphasized the contrast between human noise and the surrounding silence that swallowed it. When trees fell, the sound seemed to travel farther than expected, echoing oddly before fading. As hours passed, fatigue set in, accelerated by the cold and the uneven terrain. Marcus welcomed the rhythm of the work, the predictable sequence of cuts and movements. It kept his mind focused. Yet, even as he worked, part of his attention drifted outward, scanning the forest beyond the immediate task. That was when he noticed it. At first, it was nothing more than a darker shape among the trunks, visible only when he stepped back to wipe sweat from his face. The tree stood slightly apart from the others, not isolated, but enough to break the pattern of growth around it. Its bark appeared darker, almost charcoal in places, and its trunk seemed thicker than its height would suggest. Marcus felt a faint tightening in his chest, an instinctive reaction he had learned not to dismiss outright. He told himself it was just another tree, perhaps damaged by the storm or affected by disease. Still, his eyes returned to it again and again. Something about its presence disrupted the order of the forest, like a sentence with one word out of place. He took mental note of its position relative to nearby landmarks, an old fallen pine, a cluster of rocks coated in pale lichen. He did not approach it immediately. Experience had taught him patience. As evening drew closer and the crew wrapped up for the day, Marcus glanced towards the tree one last time. In the dimming light, its silhouette seemed heavier, its outline less defined, as though shadow clung to it more stubbornly than to the others. The forest settled into its nighttime stillness, and for the first time since arriving, Marcus found it difficult to sleep. The image of that tree lingered in his mind, not as fear, but as a question waiting to be answered. He did not yet know why the tree unsettled him, only that it did. The forest had offered him a detail out of place, and Marcus had learned long ago that such details rarely meant nothing. As the night deepened and the wind whispered through the high branches, he resolved that the next day he would take a closer look. Morning returned to the forest without ceremony. The fog thinned but did not vanish, lifting just enough to reveal the same dense geometry of trunks and shadow that had surrounded the camp the day before. Marcus rose early, as he always did, his body tuned to the rhythm of labor rather than clocks. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by the image of the darker tree standing apart from the others. It was not fear that lingered in him, but insistence. The sense that something unresolved waited just beyond the edge of attention. Work resumed methodically. The crew spread out along the designated section, engines coughing to life, steel biting into wood. Marcus moved with practiced efficiency, clearing damaged trees along the access road. Yet, even as he worked, his awareness drifted toward the spot he had marked in his mind. Each time he paused to check a cut or adjust his stance, his gaze found that same direction, as if drawn by a weak but persistent force. By mid-morning, he allowed himself to step away under the pretense of assessing potential hazards ahead of the crew's progress. He followed a shallow rise in the terrain, boots sinking slightly into the damp ground, until the tree came fully into view. Up close, the sense of wrongness sharpened. The tree did not tower dramatically above its neighbors, but its presence was undeniable. Its trunk was unnaturally thick, swelling outward in places where no healthy growth pattern should have allowed it. The bark was darker, almost scorched in tone, and uneven in texture. Large bulges protruded from its surface, some the size of a clenched fist, others much larger, as if the wood beneath had pushed outward in slow, relentless waves. Moss clung to these growths, but not evenly. In places, it seemed disturbed, as though something beneath had shifted long after the moss had settled. Marcus circled the tree slowly, keeping a respectful distance at first. The ground around its base was compacted in subtle ways that did not match the surrounding forest floor. Fallen needles lay thinner there, and small stones were pressed into the soil as if by repeated pressure. He knelt and brushed his gloved hand across the earth, noting how firm it felt compared to nearby patches. The longer he studied the tree, the more its details resisted simple explanation. The bulges were not random. They followed faint lines spiraling upward around the trunk, as though responding to something embedded deep within. Marcus had seen trees react to nails, wire, even old fence posts swallowed over decades, but this was different. Those scars were usually localized. This tree bore marks that suggested repeated intrusion, followed by long periods of growth meant to conceal. He leaned closer, examining the bark. There were old scars partially hidden beneath newer layers of wood, shallow grooves that hinted at cuts made long ago. Not the clean, modern cuts of chainsaws, but rougher, irregular marks consistent with hand tools. The idea unsettled him more than he expected. This forest was supposed to be remote, rarely touched before commercial logging began. Yet the tree told a quieter story, one that contradicted official maps and tidy explanations. Marcus straightened and glanced back toward the crew. They were distant enough now, absorbed in their work, their movements reduced to small figures between trunks. No one was paying attention to him. He considered walking away, leaving the tree untouched, another anomaly in a forest full of them. But the thought did not sit right. His instincts, sharpened by years of relying on them for safety, insisted that ignoring this would be a mistake. He tried to reason with himself. Storm damage could cause irregular growth. Disease could produce swelling. Even lightning could leave scars that looked unfamiliar after decades of healing. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the pattern, for the way the bulges aligned, or for the density of the wood beneath his probing fingers. The tree felt less like a victim of nature and more like a witness that had been forced to keep a secret. Decision settled in him quietly. If the tree posed a risk, it needed to be dealt with. If it hid something, leaving it standing would only delay the inevitable. He returned to the crew, coordinated the next phase of work, and gradually steered operations closer to the tree without drawing attention to his true interest. By early afternoon, the path of cleared ground led naturally toward it. When the moment came, Marcus prepared with deliberate care. He checked his chainsaw, tightening the chain, inspecting the teeth, refilling oil. He measured the wind, light though it was, and marked an escape route. The tree's size and irregular structure meant it could behave unpredictably when cut. He took extra time clearing brush around the base, exposing more of the trunk and its unsettling growths. Standing before it, saw idling at his side, Marcus felt a flicker of hesitation. Not fear of injury, but a deeper reluctance, as though crossing an unseen boundary. He studied the bulges one last time and noticed something that tightened his focus even further. Many of the largest growths clustered around chest height, roughly where a person might stand while working with the trunk. The realization added weight to his suspicions. Whatever had happened here, it had involved deliberate human action at a time when the tree was much younger. He positioned himself for the first cut. The saw roared to life, its familiar vibration grounding him. As the blade touched bark, resistance felt slightly different than expected. The wood gave way smoothly at first, then stiffened, as if the chain were passing through layers of uneven density. The sound changed subtly, a deeper tone that vibrated through his arms. Marcus eased off and adjusted his angle, listening closely. The tree responded with a faint creak, not the sharp protest of a healthy trunk, but a low, strained sound that suggested hollowness somewhere within. He stepped back, heart beating faster now, and considered his options. He could stop, call in a supervisor, treat it as a potential hazard requiring further assessment. Or he could continue, trusting his experience to guide him through whatever came next. He chose to continue. The second cut went deeper, confirming what he had sensed. The saw slipped through certain sections with unexpected ease, then jolted slightly against denser material. It was not metal, not yet, but it was not uniform wood either. Marcus shut off the saw and rested his forehead briefly against the cool air, collecting himself. He understood now that this tree was not merely diseased or damaged, it was altered. As he restarted the saw and committed to the cut that would determine the tree's fate, Marcus knew he had crossed from routine work into something else entirely. The forest had offered him a breach in its pattern, and he had chosen to open it. Whatever lay inside the tree, concealed by decades of growth and silence, was about to be exposed. The moment Marcus committed fully to the cut, the forest seemed to draw inward, as if holding its breath. The chainsaw bit deeper into the trunk, and the vibration that traveled up his arms felt subtly wrong, uneven in a way he had learned to respect. Wood usually answered steel predictably. It resisted, then yielded, its fibers tearing with a familiar rhythm. Here, the resistance shifted without warning. The blade slid through certain layers too easily, as though pockets of emptiness lay hidden beneath the bark, then met dense, stubborn sections that felt closer to scar tissue than living wood. The smell that rose from the cut was not just resin and sap. There was something older in it, a faint metallic tang mixed with dampness, as if the tree had sealed away air that did not belong to the present. Sawdust sprayed outward, clinging to Marcus's gloves and jacket. He noticed its color varied more than usual, pale strands mixing with darker, almost gray flecks that suggested age and compression rather than rot. As the cut deepened, the tree began to respond. A low creaking sound emerged from within the trunk, not sharp or immediate, but drawn out like a slow exhale. Marcus adjusted his stance and widened his escape path, aware that trees with internal irregularities could twist or split unpredictably. His focus narrowed to the precise angle of the blade and the subtle feedback transmitted through the saw. He trusted his body to read what his eyes could not yet see. When the final cut met the first, gravity took hold. The tree hesitated, leaning just enough to suggest it might fall cleanly, then shifted with a sudden, heavy lurch. The internal creak intensified, turning into a deep, resonant crack that echoed through the forest floor rather than the air. Marcus retreated along his planned route, eyes locked on the trunk as it began its descent. The impact was unlike any he had experienced. When the tree struck the ground, the force sent a tremor through the earth that he felt in his boots and knees. Loose needles cascaded from neighboring branches, and a brief cloud of dust and debris rose before settling back into the silence. For a moment, even the distant sounds of machinery from the rest of the crew seemed muted, as though the forest itself had absorbed the shock. Marcus stood still until he was certain the tree would not shift again. Only then did he approach the fallen trunk, heart beating faster than usual. The exposed cross-section faced him, and at first glance it looked wrong. The center was not solid. A long, irregular cavity ran through the heartwood, its edges smooth and darkened, as though time had polished them. The growth rings curved around this void, bending in unnatural arcs that revealed years of slow adaptation, of living tissue accommodating something that did not belong. He stepped closer, crouching to examine the cut more carefully. The cavity was not a simple crack caused by stress or age. Its shape was too deliberate, its boundaries too consistent. It looked like a wound that had been inflicted long ago and then carefully sealed, layer by layer, by the tree's own relentless growth. Marcus traced the outline with his eyes, imagining the years passing as the tree expanded outward, swallowing the intrusion deeper and deeper. Then he saw the glint. It was faint, barely visible at first, caught at an angle where light filtered through the canopy and struck the inner edge of the cavity. Marcus leaned closer, squinting to be sure his eyes were not deceiving him. There it was again, a dull silver reflection embedded in the wood. His pulse quickened. Metal and chainsaws were a dangerous combination. A blade striking hidden steel could shatter teeth, kick back violently or send fragments flying. Carefully, he reached for a smaller tool and probed the edge of the cavity. The wood resisted at first, then gave way with a brittle sound. He pried gently until a small corroded object loosened and dropped into his palm. It was cold, heavier than it looked, and unmistakably metal. Marcus turned it over, recognizing the shape immediately. A deformed, aged projectile, its surface pitted by rust and time. The realization brought a strange mix of relief and unease. Bullets in trees were not unheard of. Hunters fired at targets of opportunity, missed shots lodged in trunks, and over decades trees grew around them. But this bullet was deep within the heart of the tree, far deeper than a stray shot would normally penetrate. And the cavity surrounding it suggested more than a single impact. Marcus scanned the trunk again, and his suspicion was confirmed almost immediately. There were more. Small metallic shapes appeared along the length of the cavity, partially exposed where the saw had split the wood. He extracted another, then another, each requiring more effort as the tree's growth resisted, relinquishing what it had consumed. The bullets varied slightly in size and deformation, indicating different angles or moments of impact. The noise had drawn attention. Members of the crew began to approach, curiosity piqued by the unusual delay in the force of the tree's fall. Marcus straightened, holding the metal pieces loosely in his hand. He did not announce what he had found. He simply waited as the others gathered, their expressions shifting from casual interest to confusion as they took in the sight of the hollowed trunk. Most reactions were immediate and practical. Some recognized the bullets and shrugged, their disappointment clear. Others examined the cavity with narrowed eyes, uneasy but unwilling to articulate why. One of the older workers, a man whose years in the forest showed in the lines of his face and the caution of his movements, lingered longer than the rest. He crouched beside the trunk, studying the growth rings and the distribution of the metal. Marcus watched him closely. The man's expression was not surprised so much as resigned, as if this discovery confirmed something he had long suspected. He ran his fingers along the edge of the cavity, then stood and stepped back without a word. The moment passed, and attention drifted back toward work. The crew returned to their tasks, satisfied that the mystery had been explained, at least enough to move on. But Marcus did not move on. As the forest noise gradually returned, he remained by the fallen tree, staring into the cavity. Bullets alone did not account for what he was seeing. There were too many, and their placement suggested intention rather than random target practice. More importantly, the cavity extended downward, deeper into the trunk toward the base, where the saw had not yet reached. He resumed work, this time with deliberate restraint. Instead of cutting through quickly, he stripped away wood in controlled sections following the path of the cavity. Each layer removed revealed more of the tree's internal story. The growth rings grew tighter, denser, as he worked lower, indicating stress and adaptation over many years. More bullets emerged, some so embedded they had nearly fused with the surrounding wood. Marcus collected them carefully, setting them aside. He counted without consciously trying to. The number grew beyond what coincidence could reasonably explain. Someone had fired repeatedly at this tree, or at something positioned against it, long enough ago for the wood to heal over completely. As he worked, the forest seemed to press closer, the shadows deepening around the fallen trunk. The act of uncovering felt less like logging and more like excavation. Marcus was no longer simply removing material. He was revealing something that had been deliberately hidden, not just by time, but by growth itself. By the time he reached the lower third of the trunk, the cavity narrowed, then shifted direction slightly, angling toward the base. The wood there was hardest of all, packed tight and resistant. Marcus paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and took in the scene. The bullets were no longer the most important discovery. They were markers, clues pointing toward something more significant buried deeper still. He adjusted his approach, preparing to work his way down to the stump. Whatever waited there had been protected by decades of growth and silence, and now, with the tree split open and its past exposed to the light, Marcus sensed that the forest had yielded only the beginning of its secret. Marcus worked with a patience that bordered on reverence. The fallen trunk lay open before him like an exposed spine, its interior no longer hidden by bark and shadow. What had begun as routine labor had shifted into something slower, more deliberate. He no longer cut with the intention of efficiency. Each movement was measured, each adjustment cautious, as though he feared that a careless strike might erase information the tree had spent decades preserving. He stripped away the wood in thin sections, guiding the blade along the natural curves of the cavity rather than forcing a straight line through it. The deeper he went, the more the tree resisted. The wood around the hollow was dense and compressed, its fibers tight and unyielding, shaped by years of growing around foreign objects. This was not rot. There was no softness, no crumble. The tree had not been dying from the inside out. It had been adapting, reshaping itself around intrusion. More metal revealed itself as he progressed. At first, it was familiar shapes, additional bullets lodged at varying depths, some flattened, others bent, their surfaces dulled by corrosion. They emerged from the wood reluctantly, each extraction leaving behind a smooth pocket that spoke of time rather than violence. Marcus laid them aside in a growing cluster, noting their number without recording it consciously. He felt the weight of accumulation, the way repetition transformed coincidence into intent. Then the shapes began to change. Not every piece was a projectile. Some fragments were thin and elongated, their edges uneven, suggesting they had once been part of something larger. Others were curved, ring-like, half buried in the wood as if wrapped around by growth. Marcus paused more than once to examine these fragments closely, turning them in his gloved hands. They were rusted beyond easy recognition, but their forms hinted at chains, clasps, or hardware that did not belong in a living tree. The realization deepened his unease. Bullets could be explained away, dismissed as careless hunting or idle shots fired long ago. But these fragments suggested purpose. Someone had brought metal to this tree deliberately and left it there. Worse, the pattern of discovery implied sequence. The objects were not scattered randomly. They followed a rough line downward, as if guiding him toward something embedded deeper still. Marcus began to understand the tree differently. The bulges he had seen on the bark now made sense as external reflections of internal wounds. Each growth corresponded to something the tree had swallowed, each knot and swelling marking a point of forced entry. Over time, the tree had responded as trees do, not by expelling the intrusion, but by absorbing it, sealing it away beneath new layers of wood. As he worked, the forest around him seemed to recede. The sounds of machinery faded into a distant background hum, replaced by the steady rasp of the blade and the muted thud of wood falling away. His awareness narrowed to the trunk, the cavity, and the slow unveiling of whatever history lay trapped within. This no longer felt like a simple curiosity. It felt like trespass. Occasionally, Marcus glanced toward the crew. Some watched from a distance, interest tempered by caution. Others deliberately avoided looking, their attention fixed on safer, simpler tasks. The older worker he had noticed earlier kept his distance now, his body language closed, as if he did not want to see more than he already had. Marcus sensed unspoken tension rippling through the group. This discovery was unsettling not because of what it revealed, but because of what it implied. If the forest had kept this secret for so long, there was a reason. The wood near the lower half of the trunk grew increasingly complex. The cavity narrowed, its edges tightening, and the growth rings around it thickened, compressed into dense layers that spoke of stress endured year after year. Marcus slowed even further, choosing hand tools over the saw when necessary, prying and cutting carefully to avoid shattering anything hidden within. The process felt archaeological in nature, an excavation rather than a cut. It was there that he uncovered the first unmistakable sign that this was no random accumulation of debris. A length of corroded chain emerged, its links fused together by rust and resin, partially flattened by the pressure of growth. It had been wrapped or fastened against the tree, not fired into it. Marcus traced its outline in the wood, seeing how the tree had grown around each link, preserving its shape like a fossil. He leaned back, breath steady but heart pounding. Chains in trees did not happen by accident. They were placed, secured, and left behind. Combined with the bullets, they painted a picture that grew darker by the minute. This tree had been a point of focus, a place where repeated actions had occurred over time. As more fragments came free, Marcus noticed discolorations in the wood itself. Dark stains followed the cavity's edges, deeper than surface grime, soaked into the fibers. He did not need to name them to understand their significance. The tree had absorbed more than metal. It had absorbed events. Despite himself, Marcus felt a pull to continue. Part of him wanted to stop, to call for oversight, to hand responsibility to someone else, but another part, stronger and quieter, insisted that stopping now would leave the story incomplete. He had already crossed the threshold. Turning back would not undo what he had seen. When he reached the lower portion of the trunk, near where it met the stump, the resistance became formidable. The wood there was knotted and twisted, its grain spiraling tightly around a central mass. The cavity that had guided him downward seemed to close in on itself, converging toward a single point. The external bark at this level had borne the largest bulges, the most pronounced distortions, now clearly linked to what lay within. Marcus cleared soil from around the base, exposing the thick roots that spread outward like clenched fingers. The ground here was firmer than it should have been, packed and resistant, as though it had once been disturbed and then left to settle. Small stones were embedded at odd angles, and remnants of decayed material clung to the roots, hinting at objects long since dissolved. At last, his tools struck something that did not yield. Not wood, not root, but a solid, unyielding surface. The sound was unmistakable, a dull metallic knock that sent a jolt through his hands. Marcus froze, then adjusted his position to clear more wood away from the contact point. What emerged was not another fragment or loose piece. It was a flat, continuous surface, partially encased by roots and wood. The tree had grown around it completely, sealing it beneath decades of living tissue. Marcus brushed away dirt and debris, revealing more of the object's outline. It was large, rectangular, and heavy, its edges rounded by time but still intact. A container. The realization settled heavily in his chest. This was no longer about stray bullets or forgotten chains. Someone had placed this object here intentionally, using the tree itself as a vault. The roots had wrapped around it, the trunk had expanded, and the forest had kept its silence. Marcus stepped back, surveying the scene. The metal fragments above were no longer mysteries in themselves. They were remnants of the process, traces left behind as the container was secured and concealed. The tree had been wounded repeatedly, each injury marking another step in the burial. He knew then that whatever lay inside the container was the true heart of the story. Everything else had been a prelude, a series of signs leading him downward. The forest had not given up its secret easily. And as Marcus prepared to uncover what had been hidden at the roots, he understood that this discovery would carry consequences far beyond the boundaries of the logging site. The discovery of the container changed the nature of the forest around Marcus. What had once felt heavy and watchful now seemed restrained, as though the land itself had tightened around the place where the tree had stood. The fallen trunk lay open like a breached wall, but the true boundary had been lower, hidden where wood met soil. The roots, thick and intertwined, told a story of endurance and concealment that went far beyond the life of the tree alone. Marcus knelt near the base, studying the way the roots curved inward, gripping the metal surface as if they had grown specifically to hold it in place. These were not shallow roots spreading aimlessly. They were deep, powerful structures that had anchored themselves around the object, pulling it tighter with each passing year. The soil here was compacted unnaturally, packed firm in layers that suggested it had once been worked by human hands before being reclaimed by the forest. It felt less like excavation and more like undoing a deliberate act. He cleared away loose dirt with his hands first, then with careful movements of his tools. Each scoop revealed more of the container's outline. It was larger than he had initially thought, longer and deeper, wedged into the earth at a slight angle. The surface was scarred but intact, coated in a mixture of rust, hardened sap, and soil that had fused into a single crust. Roots threaded across it like cables, some thin and fibrous, others thick enough to require cutting. Marcus worked slowly, acutely aware that this stage carried the greatest risk. A sudden shift could crack the container, damage its contents, or collapse the surrounding soil. He adjusted his position repeatedly, bracing himself against the trunk remnants and stones, treating the extraction like a delicate operation rather than brute labor. Sweat gathered along his back despite the cold air, not from exertion alone, but from the pressure of knowing that this was the moment everything led toward. As more of the container came into view, details emerged. There were faint impressions along one edge that suggested hinges long since rusted in place. A distorted loop of metal hinted at a locking mechanism, perhaps once secured with a chain or heavy clasp. This had not been a temporary hiding place. It had been designed to last, to remain untouched long enough for the forest itself to erase its presence. Marcus paused, resting back on his heels, and took in the scene. The tree, now reduced to segments of trunk and scattered wood, had served as both shield and accomplice. Its roots had done what concrete and steel could not, locking the container away in living matter that grew stronger with time. The realization sent a chill through him. Whoever had hidden this object had understood the forest intimately. They had trusted it to keep a secret. The surrounding air felt different now, heavier, as if the act of uncovering the container had altered the balance of the place. Marcus noticed that even the distant noise of machinery seemed dulled, muffled by the slope and the density of trees. It was as though this spot existed in a pocket of isolation, separate from the rest of the worksite. When the container was finally free enough to move, Marcus tested its weight carefully. It resisted at first, reluctant to leave the cradle formed by roots and soil. With steady pressure, he eased it upward, breaking the last bonds that held it fast. The earth released it reluctantly, leaving behind a hollow that looked like a wound in the ground, dark and damp, its edges marked by torn roots and compressed soil. He set the container down on a flat section of ground, clearing debris away until it rested fully exposed. The metal was cold under his touch, its surface uneven but solid. This was no fragile relic. It had been built to endure, and it had succeeded. Marcus straightened slowly, his back aching, and became aware of eyes on him. A few members of the crew had drifted closer again, curiosity overcoming their earlier restraint. Their expressions ranged from fascination to unease. No one spoke. No one needed to. The object between them demanded attention without explanation. For a long moment, Marcus did nothing. He simply stood there, looking at the container, feeling the weight of the decision before him. He understood that at this point, he could still choose to stop. He could mark the location, report it through official channels, and step back. Responsibility would shift away from him. Procedures would take over. The story would become paperwork, filtered through authorities who might never fully grasp what the forest had preserved. But he also knew that doing so meant surrendering control over the truth. It meant risking that the contents would be mishandled, dismissed, or quietly set aside if they proved inconvenient. The tree had guarded this secret for decades. Now that it was exposed, the question was not whether it should be seen, but how. Marcus knelt again and examined the container more closely. He traced the edges, noting where corrosion had weakened the metal and where it remained stubbornly intact. The locking mechanism was fused shut, but not beyond the reach of careful effort. There was no sign of explosives, no markings that suggested immediate danger. Whatever was inside had been placed there deliberately and sealed away, not booby-trapped or meant to harm a finder. The crew waited, tension thickening as minutes passed. Marcus could feel their expectations pressing against him, conflicting desires layered beneath silence. Some wanted answers. Others wanted distance. A few likely wished he would simply close the earth back over the container and pretend none of this had happened. Instead, Marcus made his choice. He began to work on the lock. It took time and patience. Rust flaked away in stubborn sheets, and the metal groaned faintly as he applied pressure. At last, with a dull crack that echoed softly against the trees, the seal gave way. Marcus paused, hand resting on the lid, breathing slow and steady. This was the point of no return. Whatever lay inside would reshape the meaning of everything he had uncovered so far. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside, the container was lined with fabric, once thick and protective, now stiff with age but still intact in places. The cloth had been folded deliberately, layered to cushion whatever it wrapped. Marcus peeled it back piece by piece, each movement revealing more of the contents and deepening the sense that this was no careless hiding place. Objects emerged gradually. Small items first, arranged with precision, metal pieces that were not weapons, personal effects that spoke of individual lives rather than anonymous actions. Marcus felt his throat tighten as recognition dawned. These were not tools or valuables meant to be reclaimed. They were remnants, preserved not for future use, but because someone had needed them hidden. As he uncovered more, the shape of the truth began to form. This container was not treasure. It was evidence. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. The forest around him remained silent, as if waiting. He understood now why the tree had grown as it had, why the metal fragments and bullets marked the path downward. Everything had led to this. The roots had locked the secret away, and the tree had borne the scars of that burden until the moment it could no longer stand. When Marcus looked back into the container, he knew that what he held in his hands would not stay buried again. The forest had kept its silence long enough. The container sat open between the torn roots and the broken remnants of the trunk, its contents exposed to air for the first time in decades. Marcus felt as though the forest itself had shifted, not dramatically, but in a way that settled deep in his chest. This was no longer a discovery that could be mistaken for coincidence or curiosity. The weight of intention pressed down on him with every object he uncovered. He began by laying the items out carefully on a cleared section of ground, arranging them not out of habit, but out of instinct. Each piece deserved to be seen, to be understood in relation to the others. There were documents first, folded and wrapped to protect them from moisture. Time had not been kind to them, but enough remained to read fragments of ink, dates, and handwritten notes. Some pages were brittle, others softened into near transparency, but together they formed a timeline that did not belong to nature. These were records, not meant for weather or decay, but for memory. Marcus examined them slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the faded markings. Names appeared, some repeated, others standing alone. There were dates that clustered around a particular span of years, far enough in the past to escape easy recollection, but recent enough to matter. Margins carried symbols and numbers that looked like coordinates or references to landmarks, not official maps, but directions meant for someone who already knew the terrain. Beneath the documents lay personal belongings. A wallet with its leather stiffened and cracked, the edges rounded smooth by time. Inside, a photograph so faded it was difficult to distinguish faces, yet unmistakably human in its intent. A small metal tag, engraved with markings that suggested identification, though not of any modern standardized kind. These were not objects chosen for their value. They were chosen because they belonged to someone. Marcus felt a tightening in his throat as he held each item. The forest had preserved them without judgment, but now that preservation demanded acknowledgement. These things spoke of people who had been here, who had stood among these trees and left behind pieces of themselves that were never meant to remain. There were other objects as well, more troubling in their implication. Lengths of wire, bent and twisted, metal fasteners shaped by repeated strain, fragments that suggested restraint rather than construction. Marcus did not dwell on them longer than necessary, but their presence altered the tone of everything else. They hinted at actions taken, not accidents suffered. As the inventory grew, patterns emerged. The documents corresponded with the personal items, linking names to possessions, places to events. Marcus realized that the container had not been filled hastily. The items had been organized, grouped with care. Someone had wanted this information preserved intact, not scattered or destroyed. That intention disturbed him more than outright malice would have. It suggested foresight, calculation, and time. The older worker lingered at the edge of Marcus's awareness, watching without approaching. His posture told Marcus enough. Recognition had settled there, not of specific details, but of a familiar weight. This was not the first time the forest had whispered such truths to someone. It was simply the first time it had done so this loudly. The stories Marcus had heard before returning to this place began to resurface in his mind. Rumors of hunters who never returned, of men who came looking for work and vanished into seasonal camps that were later found empty. of official explanations that never quite matched the unease that lingered afterward. At the time, those stories had seemed distant, abstract. Now they pressed close, anchored by physical evidence that could no longer be dismissed. He felt anger then, sharp and sudden. Anger at whoever had done this, at whoever had hidden these lives away and trusted the forest to erase them. Anger at the quiet complicity of time, at the ease with which memory faded when left unattended. It was not a dramatic fury, but a steady, burning resolve that settled into his bones. Around him, the crew grew restless. Some avoided looking directly at the items, their discomfort evident in the way they busied themselves with unnecessary tasks. Others watched too closely, eyes lingering on anything that might be worth money, value, or leverage. Marcus sensed the tension building, the way differing motivations began to pull at the edges of the group. He knew that not everyone saw this discovery as he did. To some, it represented trouble, delay, scrutiny. To others, opportunity. The forest had revealed something that did not belong to any one person. Yet now it was subject to human interpretation, with all the flaws that entailed. The possibility of consequences became impossible to ignore. Whatever had been hidden here had remained so for a reason. If these items surfaced officially, questions would follow. Investigations would reopen. Old wounds would be disturbed. Marcus considered the implications not only for himself, but for the people who worked beside him, for families who might be connected to the names he now held in his hands. As he continued examining the contents, one item drew his attention more than the others. It was small, unassuming, easy to overlook amid the more dramatic finds. A piece of metal marked with a symbol, partially obscured by corrosion. Marcus turned it over, cleaning it carefully. The marking was deliberate, distinct, something meant to identify rather than decorate. It appeared again on one of the documents, faintly sketched near a cluster of numbers. The connection sent a jolt through him. This was not merely a record of the past, it was a key. He studied the coordinates again, aligning them mentally with the landscape he knew. A particular bend in a stream, a ridge that cut across the slope at a specific angle. The more he traced it in his mind, the clearer it became. The container was not the final destination. It was a waypoint, a safeguard for information meant to lead somewhere else. That realization brought with it a new kind of fear. If there was more hidden in this forest, if this was only part of what had been concealed, then the danger was not confined to history. It extended into the present. Someone else might know about these locations. Someone might be watching, waiting to see whether the secret stayed buried or surfaced at last. Marcus felt suddenly exposed. The forest that had once felt distant and impersonal now seemed aware of him, of his role in uncovering its memory. Every sound carried significance. The snap of a branch, the shift of wind through needles, even the distant clatter of tools felt charged with meaning. He gathered the most important items together, separating them from the rest. This was not about possession. It was about preservation. He needed to ensure that whatever happened next, the truth would not be lost again. He photographed what he could with his phone, documenting details carefully, knowing that physical objects could disappear, but records might endure. The decision forming inside him was heavy but clear. He could not simply hand this over to those who wished it gone, nor could he ignore it and walk away. The forest had entrusted him with something, not because he had sought it, but because he had been willing to see. As dusk approached, Marcus closed the container, not sealing it, but protecting its contents from the night air. He hid it as best he could among the roots and debris, knowing this was only temporary. The next step would require careful thought and deliberate action, taken away from the noise and pressure of the work site. Standing there, surrounded by trees that had witnessed far more than they revealed, Marcus understood that his life had shifted irreversibly. What he had found could not be unseen. The forest had spoken, and now it was his responsibility to decide whether its truth would finally be heard or buried once more beneath silence and growth. Night came quietly, as it always did in that part of the mountains. There was no sharp transition, no dramatic fall of darkness. Instead, the forest thickened around Marcus, shadows merging until the spaces between the trees became indistinguishable from the trunks themselves. The camp lights glowed faintly in the distance, small islands of human presence swallowed by the mass of wood and earth. Marcus remained apart, seated on a fallen log near the place where the tree had stood, his thoughts circling the container and everything it represented. He had secured the most critical items and hidden them with care, not to claim ownership, but to buy time. Time to think without eyes on him, without pressure, without the constant hum of machinery. The forest, stripped of noise for the night, felt different now, less hostile, less heavy. It was not welcoming, but it was patient, as if it had done its part and was now waiting to see what he would do with what it had given him. Marcus replayed the day in his mind, not as a series of actions, but as a sequence of realizations. The strange tree, the bullets embedded far too deep to be accidental, the chain, the container locked into the roots like a secret fused to bone, and finally, the contents that turned suspicion into certainty. None of it had been random. The forest had not simply grown over debris, it had grown around a story. He thought about the people whose belongings he had held. He tried to imagine them not as names on fading paper, but as living individuals moving through this same terrain. Men who had walked these slopes, followed these streams, trusted the forest enough to turn their backs on it. Whatever had happened to them had not been sudden or careless. It had been deliberate, and afterward someone had taken the time to hide the evidence, trusting the slow, relentless work of nature to erase what human memory might not. Marcus understood then that the forest was not complicit in this concealment. It had not chosen to hide the truth, it had simply done what forests do. It had grown, it had healed its wounds. It had absorbed what was forced into it and carried the marks forward, waiting for someone patient enough to read them. In that sense, the forest was not an accomplice. It was a witness. That realization changed something fundamental in him. He no longer felt like an intruder disturbing a secret. He felt like a reader finally opening a book that had been left unfinished. The scars on the trees, the altered soil, the absence of wildlife in certain pockets, all of it formed a language he had spent years learning without knowing why. His work had trained him to notice patterns, to respect anomalies. Now those skills had led him here. Sleep did not come easily. When Marcus finally returned to camp and lay in his bunk, his body rested, but his mind remained alert. He listened to the subtle sounds of the night, the distant call of an owl, the shift of wind across the canopy. Nothing felt threatening, yet everything felt significant. He sensed that the forest had already accepted him as part of its story. Whether that was a burden or an honor remained unclear. Before dawn, he rose again. The sky was still dark, but the air carried the faint promise of morning. Marcus moved quietly, gathering the notes he had made, reviewing the photographs he had taken. His eyes returned again and again to the coordinates and markings from the container. They formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. When he overlaid those directions onto his mental map of the forest, the destination became clearer. It was not far, but it was off the established paths, beyond the zones marked for logging. A shallow ravine intersected by a narrow stream, a place most crews avoided because the ground there was unstable and the trees grew too tightly for efficient work. Marcus had passed it before without giving it much thought. Now it stood out as sharply as the strange tree had the day before. He waited until the camp stirred, until the noise of preparation masked his movements. Then he set off alone, carrying only what he needed. The forest seemed to guide him, subtle shifts in terrain confirming the direction he had chosen. As he moved deeper, signs of old human activity began to appear, faint but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. Stones arranged not quite naturally, a depression in the ground that did not match erosion patterns, the remains of a fire pit, long cold, its ash dispersed but not gone. The ravine revealed itself gradually. The stream cut a narrow path through the soil, its water clear and cold. The banks bore signs of reinforcement, logs placed long ago to prevent collapse. Nearby, Marcus spotted fragments of decayed wood that might once have been part of a structure. Nails lay scattered, rusted nearly beyond recognition, but still aligned in a way that suggested walls rather than fallen branches. His pulse quickened. This was not speculation anymore. This place had been used. Not briefly, not accidentally, but with intention. He moved carefully, scanning the ground, reading the forest floor the way he read tree rings. The signs told a story of repeated visits, of people returning to the same spot over time. Then he found something that confirmed it beyond doubt. Partially buried near the edge of the ravine was an object that matched the markings from the container. The same symbol, etched faintly into metal, worn by years of exposure. Marcus crouched, brushing away soil, his breath steady but shallow. The object was not large, but its presence anchored the abstract into the tangible. This was a continuation, not an echo. Standing there, Marcus felt the full weight of the choice before him. If he continued, if he brought this to light, there would be no turning back. The forest would lose its silence, at least in this place. Investigators would come. Trees would be marked and cut for reasons other than logging. The land would be transformed, not by storms or growth, but by scrutiny. Yet, if he turned away, if he chose to keep this knowledge to himself, the forest would close over it again. Roots would grow, soil would settle, and the truth would remain buried, protected by time and neglect. Marcus straightened slowly, looking around at the trees that ringed the ravine. They stood, as they always had, indifferent to human morality, yet holding its consequences within their rings and roots. He understood then that the forest did not demand action. It offered memory. What humans did with that memory was their responsibility alone. As the sun began to rise, casting thin bands of light through the branches, Marcus made his decision. It was not a dramatic moment, not a surge of courage or fear. It was a quiet alignment of values, shaped by years of work, respect for the land, and an unwillingness to accept silence as resolution. He turned back toward the camp, already planning his next steps. The forest remained behind him, unchanged in appearance, yet altered forever in meaning. It had borne witness long enough. Now it was time for someone else to listen. Morning returned to the forest dressed in ordinariness. Engines coughed to life, radios crackled with short bursts of coordination, and men moved through the camp with the same routines they had followed for years. To anyone watching from the outside, it was another workday in another remote logging zone. Only Marcus felt the weight beneath the surface, the invisible line that had been crossed and could never be erased. He stood for a moment at the edge of the clearing, looking toward the place where the strange tree had stood. The ground there was scarred now, churned by boots and tools, the stump reduced to rough edges and exposed soil. Without the tree, the area looked smaller, less imposing. It would have been easy to believe that whatever power it held had vanished with it. Marcus knew better. The absence itself was a reminder. Something had been there long enough to grow, to adapt, to hide a truth inside living matter. Removing it did not undo what it had witnessed. As the crew resumed their work, Marcus felt a subtle shift in how he moved among them. Conversations happened around him, but not through him. Some men avoided his eyes, uneasy with what they knew he had uncovered. Others watched him too closely, as if trying to read his intentions before he voiced them. The discovery had fractured the easy neutrality of shared labor. Each person now carried their own version of what it meant, shaped by fear, greed, or conscience. Marcus focused on his tasks, performing them with the same care he always had. The physical motion grounded him, reminding him that whatever decision he carried inside did not absolve him of responsibility to the present. Still, his thoughts moved constantly ahead, assembling possibilities, anticipating resistance. By midday, it became clear that the tension would not dissolve on its own. The container could not remain hidden indefinitely. The coordinates, the secondary site, the documented evidence all pointed toward a story larger than one tree or one crew. Silence, Marcus understood, would not preserve peace. It would only preserve uncertainty, allowing speculation to grow unchecked. He considered the interests at play. The company would want the matter contained, minimized, framed as an anomaly rather than a revelation. Authorities would approach it cautiously, aware that reopening old cases often exposed uncomfortable truths about past negligence. Individuals connected to what had happened decades ago might still be alive, their lives built on the assumption that the forest had done its work thoroughly. Marcus was not naive about the cost of involvement. He knew that stepping forward would invite scrutiny into his own life. His actions would be questioned, his motives examined. Work could be lost, reputations could be damaged. Yet the alternative weighed heavier. To walk away would be to accept that the lives represented by those belongings were less important than convenience. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus made his preparations quietly. He ensured that copies of the photographs and notes were stored securely, not reliant on a single device. He organized the physical evidence carefully, protecting it from further degradation. These were not acts of defiance, they were acts of preservation. When the opportunity came, it was less dramatic than he might have imagined. A routine check-in from a regional supervisor provided the opening. Marcus presented the discovery plainly, without embellishment, without speculation. He described what he had found, where it had been found, and why it could not be ignored. He did not accuse, he did not demand. He simply refused to minimize. The reaction was predictable. Initial skepticism, followed by concern, then calculation. Questions were asked, not all of them relevant. Marcus answered what he could, withheld nothing essential, and insisted on formal documentation. The process began slowly, but it began. The forest changed almost immediately. Sections of land were marked, not for cutting, but for examination. Vehicles arrived that did not belong to the logging company. People walked the ground differently now, eyes scanning for traces rather than timber. The work site transformed into something else entirely, a place of inquiry rather than extraction. Marcus felt a strange sense of distance as it unfolded. He had set events in motion, but he was no longer their center. Others took over, trained to interpret evidence, to reconstruct narratives from fragments. His role shifted from actor to witness, then to something quieter. He remained available, answered questions, guided investigators through terrain he knew well. But the burden he had carried alone began, gradually, to distribute itself. Not everything was resolved quickly. Names from the documents led to records half forgotten, files buried in archives. Families were located, some reluctant to reopen wounds, others desperate for any certainty at all. The process was uneven, painful in places, incomplete in others. Marcus watched it with a mix of relief and sorrow. Truth, he learned, rarely arrived whole. When the logging operation finally moved on, the forest reclaimed its surface calm. Rain softened the disturbed soil. New growth began at the edges of clearings. From a distance, the land appeared unchanged. Only those who knew where to look could see the subtle markers of what had happened, the places where human attention had pierced the veneer of wilderness. On his last day at the site, Marcus returned alone to the ravine. Investigators had finished their work there, leaving behind little more than footprints and flagged spots that would soon be removed. The stream flowed as it always had, indifferent to the significance humans assigned to its banks. Marcus stood quietly, letting the sounds of the forest settle around him. He thought about the tree again, about the way it had grown around metal and memory, absorbing violence without judgment. He understood now that the forest had not been hiding the truth out of malice or mystery. It had simply been patient. It had waited for someone capable of noticing what others passed by. As he turned to leave, Marcus felt no triumph, no sense of heroism. What remained was a sober understanding of responsibility. Some choices did not end with resolution. They lingered, shaping how a person moved through the world afterward. He carried that understanding with him as he left the forest behind. Wherever he worked next, whatever ground he stood on, he knew he would never see trees the same way again. Every trunk, every root held the potential of memory. And sometimes all it took to bring that memory into the light was one person willing to look closer and refuse to turn away. If this story kept you watching until the end, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, and check out the other videos waiting for you right now. Share this video with someone who loves deep, unexpected stories, and let more people discover what's hidden beneath the surface.